Juan Carlos I, the silent battle with the disease that took his mother. Abu Dhabi, at 87, King Emeritus of Spain Juan Carlos I is undergoing one of the most difficult trials of his life. His health, which had been his steadfast ally during his years of fighting and non-stop action, has now turned against him, forcing him to face a harsh reality, the same terminal osteoarthritis that took the life of his mother, Queen Maria de las Mercedes. The disease has eaten into every joint, making every movement heavy and painful. His left leg has almost completely lost its ability to react, making his once decisive, powerful steps a distant memory. Over more than 2 decades, he has undergone more than a dozen surgeries on his knees and hips, hoping to regain his freedom of movement. He once went to Switzerland to try stem cell therapy, an advanced medical method that was expected to bring miracles, but the results were still zero. Recently, doctors confirmed a news that was difficult for him to accept: he would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. This decision not only limited his body but also hit his self-esteem, his belief in independence that he had always held dear. His exile in Abu Dhabi had already brought him much loneliness. Far from his country, far from the royal family, far from the ports where the cheers of the Sangzingso yacht races once echoed, the small and rare joy that connected him to his glorious past, now illness had further narrowed his world. Even meetings with friends and trips abroad became a challenge. However, Juan Carlos I was determined to protect his strong public image. He kept his wheelchair a secret, avoiding revealing his weak moments to the camera. When he appeared, he always used a cane, leaned on his bodyguard, walked slowly but with great effort, as if to tell the world that he was still the king who had overcome political storms and historical upheavals. Amidst the loneliness in a foreign land and the silent destruction of illness, perhaps the greatest thing that remained for Juan Carlos I was his will. Even though he knew that he would never return to the days of roaming the decks of his ships, or freely walking the corridors of his palace, he still chose to hold his head high, like the last warrior on his own battlefield. For those who knew Juan Carlos I in his prime, it is hard to imagine that the man who once sailed through Spain's turbulent political waters would now be confined to the confines of his own body. He was a symbol of vitality, of agility, both mentally and physically. From his youthful years conquering the yacht races, to his grueling world tours, Juan Carlos I was always associated with dynamism, rarely willing to stop. But the disease spared no one, and for him it was not just a decline in health but also a cruel reminder of time. There were mornings when the sun shone through the large windows of his Abu Dhabi villa. He looked out to sea but could not walk down to the docks. The wheelchair in the corner of the room was a silent shadow, reminding him that his days of freedom were behind him. Relatives and close friends say that what hurts him most is not the physical pain, but the feeling of helplessness when he cannot participate in activities that were once his passion. The yacht race in Sangzingso, which used to make his eyes light up every time he mentioned it, can now only be watched on a screen, while the sound of the waves and the smell of the sea breeze that he loved now only exist in his memory. However, Juan Carlos I still maintains an unchanging habit. Every morning, he puts on a neat suit, adjusts his tie, and walks out to the living room with a cane as if preparing for an audience. It is not just a ritual, but a way for him to affirm to himself that he is still king, even though the throne is now far away. He asks his bodyguards and staff to absolutely not take or share any pictures showing him in a wheelchair, a principle that shows deep self-respect, and is also the last shield to protect his strong image in the eyes of the public. It is said that in Abu Dhabi, he rarely laughed as loudly as before, but when someone mentioned the sea, the boat, or the days in Spain, his eyes still sparkled. That is something that no illness, no distance can take away. If I wanted, I could have written the last paragraph to close the story on a low, emotional note, highlighting his loneliness but pride in the last years of his life. There were afternoons when the red sun gradually disappeared behind the horizon of the Gulf. Juan Carlos I sat quietly on the balcony, his hands resting on the armrest of the chair, feeling the warm wind carrying a faint scent of salt. In those moments, he seemed to see again the image of his mother, Queen Maria de las Mercedes, who had also spent the last years of her life in the throes of osteoarthritis. He understood that fate had arranged a strange cycle, where both mother and son were tied together in an unwinnable battle. The loneliness in a foreign land was sometimes heavier than the illness. Old friends rarely visited, children and grandchildren were busy with their own lives, short video calls were only enough to ask a few questions. At times, he wanted to return to Spain, to breathe the air of his homeland once more, to hear the church bells, to feel the taste of morning coffee in Madrid, but he knew that the return would not be easy, both physically and politically. A trusted servant said that on sleepless nights, he often asked to play back the documentary footage of his official visits while he was still on the throne. The image of a king stepping off a private plane, waving to thousands of people, or shaking hands with heads of state, made him both proud and bitter. He smiled when he saw himself as young and strong, but his eyes quickly darkened when he realized that time had taken everything away. However, Juan Carlos I did not allow himself to be completely defeated. He still read the newspaper every morning, still followed the situation in Spain, and sometimes sent messages to old friends in the sports and political world. He maintained a pace of life, albeit slow, as a way to fight against the erosion of time. At 87, he knew that he could not avoid the limitations of his body, but he still chose to face it with the pride of a king who had ruled a country during a turbulent period in history. The wheelchair may accompany him until the end of his life, but the spirit that has carried him through so many storms is something that nothing can bind. And perhaps, one day, when the sea is calm and the wind is calm, the image of Juan Carlos I will appear again in Sang Xingso, no longer the champion on the deck, but an indomitable symbol, leaning on a stick, watching the white sails fill with wind, as if to say goodbye to his youth. Sometimes, in the rare moments when he was alone, Juan Carlos I would let his mind drift back to the early days of his youth, when everything was open, when every step was light and strong, when the future was not overshadowed by illness or difficult decisions. He remembered the intense training trips at sea, the feeling of his hands gripping the wheel, the sweat and salt splashing on his face. These were memories so vivid that, sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the waves crashing against the side of the boat. But then reality returned, cold and unforgiving. Every morning when he woke, he needed the help of his servants to move from bed to chair. The dull pain in his joints was a reminder that time was running out. Some days, it became so intense that he had to sit still for hours, silently watching the light in his room change from bright yellow to pale gray. Yet, despite everything, deep down, he still kept for himself a kingdom, a place where illness could not penetrate. It was his memory, his pride, his awareness that he had helped shape a period of Spanish history. He never allowed himself to appear in public looking completely weak, because he knew that such an image would be etched in the memory of his people, and he wanted them to remember him as someone who stood firm, not someone who was knocked down. Those close to him say that, whenever the weather in Abu Dhabi became cooler in the evening, he would ask to be taken out onto the field, sit still and look out into the distance, where the horizon met the sea. Perhaps he was thinking about the days gone by, or simply waiting for a breeze that would carry the scent of home. For Juan Carlos I, this illness was not only the final test of his life, it was also a battle to retain the most intact part of himself, his pride, his independence of spirit, and his undying love for his country. If you wish, I can add a symbolic epilogue, closing the article with a haunting and solemn image, in the style of European journalistic biographies.